The chamber of Queen Drev was built to make even the most confident beings feel slightly misplaced. It was not simply large, it was precise. Every angle, every beam of pale light, every silent column seemed to exist with the quiet intention of reminding visitors that they were temporary, and she was not. Across the vast floor, polished to a mirror-like finish, figures stood in carefully measured distances from one another, as if even standing too close might be considered a strategic error. Drev did not move. She rarely needed to. Her long ears, slender and slightly curved at the tips, angled just enough to signal attention as the briefing officer cleared his throat for the third time in under a minute. That alone was noteworthy. Beings did not usually require multiple attempts to speak in her presence. They either spoke immediately or forgot how to speak entirely. "Your Majesty," the officer finally managed, "the Joint Border Unit has submitted its updated combat records." A faint pause followed. Not hesitation, evaluation. "And," Drev's voice carried without effort, smooth and controlled, yet somehow making the officer feel as if he had already said something incorrect. "There is an anomaly." That word moved through the chamber like a small ripple across still water. Several advisors exchanged brief glances. One of the generals, a towering figure with layered armor that hummed softly with defensive fields, shifted his weight in mild curiosity. Drev's gaze did not change. "Define anomaly." The officer swallowed, then adjusted the small data slate in his hands, as if it might rearrange reality into something more acceptable. "A human soldier, Your Majesty, assigned to the outer perimeter units. 16 confirmed engagements. No losses." Silence. Not the kind of silence that came from confusion. The kind that came from disbelief that was too dignified to announce itself loudly. One of the advisors let out a quiet, accidental sound, something between a cough and a suppressed laugh. Another leaned slightly toward his neighbor and whispered, "Perhaps the enemies were very cooperative." Drev did not acknowledge them. Her attention remained fixed on the officer, who now looked as if he would have preferred to be reassigned to a collapsing star. 16 victories, she repeated, not as a question, but as a test. "Yes, Your Majesty." "No losses?" "Yes, Your Majesty." A brief pause stretched, thin and deliberate. "Then either your records are flawed," Drev said calmly, "or the definition of victory has been generously interpreted." A few faint smiles appeared among the court. The tension eased just enough to be noticeable. The officer shook his head quickly. "The records have been verified multiple times. Tactical logs, drone footage, allied confirmations, everything aligns." "Everything aligns," one of the generals muttered under his breath. "That is usually when something is very wrong." Drave leaned slightly forward, her expression unchanged, though something sharper had settled behind her eyes. "A human," she said. 16 engagements, no losses." Her long ears shifted again, this time in a subtle, thoughtful motion. "And no one found this unusual until now?" The officer hesitated, which was already an answer. "We assumed," he admitted carefully, "that the reports were embellished. Humans have a tendency to exaggerate," another advisor offered, unable to resist. "Interpret events with enthusiasm," the officer corrected, choosing his survival over accuracy. A soft ripple of restrained amusement passed through the chamber. Drev did not smile. Instead, she extended one hand slightly, and the officer immediately stepped forward, placing the data slate into her grasp with the kind of caution usually reserved for unstable explosives. She glanced at it only briefly. Her eyes moved quickly, efficiently, absorbing details in seconds that would take others minutes. Tactical formations, environmental conditions, casualty reports. Then she stopped. Not dramatically, not visibly enough for most to notice, but she stopped. Her gaze lingered on a sequence of movements described in clean, unembellished language. No heroic phrasing, no unnecessary detail, just decisions, adjustments, outcomes. She set the slate aside. "Bring him," she said. The officer blinked. "Your Majesty?" "The human." A pause. "You wish to question him?" Drev tilted her head slightly, her long ears following the motion with quiet precision. I wish to determine whether I am being presented with fiction or incompetence. A few heads lowered to hide smiles. The officer nodded quickly. At once. As he turned to leave, one of the advisors leaned slightly toward another and whispered, "If he truly won 16 battles, I would like to ask how." The other advisor replied just as quietly, "If he truly won 16 battles, I would like to stand very far away from wherever he stands." At the far end of the chamber, a guard allowed himself the smallest exhale. Drev remained still once more, her gaze drifting. Not unfocused, but narrowed in a way that suggested something had caught her interest in a way she had not expected. 16 victories meant nothing, but clarity did. And something in those records had been clear. That more than anything was the problem. The summons traveled faster than most ships. Not physically, of course. Physically, the human arrived 23 minutes late. No one mentioned it at first, which made it worse. The chamber doors parted with their usual smooth precision, revealing a figure who did not appear particularly legendary. He was neither heavily armored nor ceremonially dressed. His uniform showed signs of actual use. Small abrasions, slight discolorations that suggested environments less polished than this one. He paused just inside the threshold, as if allowing his eyes a moment to adjust, or perhaps allowing the room a moment to judge him first. The room did. Several members of the court leaned forward subtly, expecting something. Confidence, arrogance, visible brilliance, anything that could justify 16 victories. The human took 3 steps forward, stopped at what he must have calculated was an acceptable distance, and gave a salute that was technically perfect and emotionally neutral. "Human soldier," Drev said, her voice reaching him without effort. "You are late." A faint pause. "Yes," he said. The answer landed strangely in the air, as if it had arrived without the usual protective layers of excuses. One of the advisors blinked. Another leaned slightly toward his neighbor and whispered, "That was short." Drev's gaze remained steady. "Explain." The human shifted his weight very slightly, not nervously, more like someone deciding which version of the truth would cause the least damage. "The navigation system recalculated 3 times," he said. "I followed it the first 2 times. The third time, I stopped listening." A quiet murmur passed through the chamber. "You ignored a calibrated navigation system?" one of the generals asked, unable to hide his disbelief. "Yes." "Why?" "It was wrong." The general opened his mouth, then closed it again, as if the concept required further negotiation. Drev tilted her head a fraction, her long ears adjusting with the movement. "And you determined this?" "How?" The human glanced briefly at the polished floor, then back up. "It tried to route me through a maintenance corridor that does not exist." A pause. "That corridor exists," one of the engineers in the chamber said immediately. The human shook his head. "It used to." Silence followed, this time with a slightly different texture. The engineer frowned. "It was sealed 3 months ago," the human said, still in the same calm tone. "After a structural collapse. I was there." The engineer stopped speaking. Somewhere in the chamber, someone made a small sound that might have been appreciation or discomfort. Drev did not look at the engineer. Her attention remained fixed on the human. "You chose to distrust a system designed to be more accurate than you," she said. "Yes." "And you were correct." "Yes." Another pause. One of the advisors leaned back slowly. "I am beginning to see how he survives," he murmured. The human remained where he was, neither defensive nor proud, simply present. Drev rose. The motion was smooth, unhurried, yet it shifted the entire atmosphere of the chamber. Conversation ceased, movements stilled. Even the low hum of distant systems seemed to quiet in acknowledgement. She descended the steps of her throne with measured precision, each step deliberate without being theatrical. When she stopped, she stood directly in front of him, close enough to observe details most would miss. He did not look away. That, more than anything else so far, was unusual. Most avoided her gaze out of instinct, some out of fear, a rare few out of calculation. This one simply did not think to. 16 victories, she said, her voice lower now, no less controlled. No losses. The human nodded once. I would like you to explain the first. A brief pause. Yes, he said again. He did not begin immediately. Instead, he seemed to arrange the memory in his mind, not for effect, but for accuracy. It was not supposed to be a battle, he said. It started as a routine patrol along the outer border. The terrain was unstable, low gravity fluctuations, intermittent sensor interference. We were told to expect nothing. A faint smile appeared on one of the general's faces. That is usually when something happens, he muttered. The human continued, unaffected. We detected movement, not large, not organized. At first we assumed debris. And it was not debris, Drev said. No. What was it? He paused just slightly. Something that was very good at pretending to be debris. A few members of the court exchanged glances. That is not reassuring, an advisor whispered. The human's expression did not change. It adapted to our scans, adjusted its profile. We only noticed because one piece of debris moved differently. Differently how? Drev asked. It hesitated. A brief silence followed. Hesitated, one of the advisors repeated, as if testing the word. Yes, the human said. Everything else drifted naturally. That piece stopped for a fraction of a second, then continued. That is what alerted you? Drev asked. Yes. Another pause. That seems very small, the advisor said. The human nodded. It was. And you built a victory on something that small? The human considered that for a moment. No, he said. I built a decision on it. The victory came later. A quiet shift moved through the chamber, subtle but unmistakable. Drev's gaze remained steady, though something behind it had sharpened further. Continue, she said. And he did. The chamber did not breathe, yet something about the silence felt alive. The human stood exactly where he had been, as if movement might interrupt the memory he was carefully unfolding. Queen Drev watched him with a stillness that was not passive. It was focused, sharpened, almost surgical. He continued. We adjusted our formation, he said, not dramatically, just enough to create a different angle of observation. If it reacted again, we would know. And it did, Drev said. Yes. How? It tried to correct the hesitation. A faint murmur moved through the chamber. That is contradictory, one of the advisors said quietly. The human gave a small nod. Yes, it learned too quickly. Real debris does not learn. A few heads tilted at that. Drev's long ears shifted slightly, the motion subtle but precise. So you identified it as an adaptive threat? Yes. And then? He paused just briefly, as if deciding how much detail would be useful. We did not engage immediately. That caused a reaction. You delayed? One of the generals asked, his tone caught between disbelief and curiosity. Yes. Why? The human glanced toward him, then back to Drev. Because it wanted us to. A short silence followed. That is not how most threats behave, the general said. No, the human replied, which is why we assumed it was not most threats. There was a quiet shift in the room again. Not skepticism this time, attention. Drev stepped slightly closer, her presence narrowing the space between them without feeling aggressive. Explain your assumption. It adapted to observation, he said. It encouraged detection without fully revealing itself. That suggested it was measuring our response. And you chose not to respond, Drev said. Yes. A faint smile flickered across one of the advisors' faces. Denying the enemy satisfaction. I like this human already. The human did not react to the comment. We altered our signal output, he continued. Reduced our scan intensity, adjusted our movement patterns. We made ourselves less interesting. Less interesting, Drev repeated. Yes. That is a difficult strategy to apply in a battlefield. It worked, he said simply. A brief ripple of restrained laughter moved through the chamber. One of the younger officers leaned toward his neighbor and whispered, I have been unintentionally using that strategy my entire career. His neighbor nodded. It has worked for you. The human continued as if none of it existed. It followed us, he said. Of course it did, Drev murmured. It stayed at a distance, continued adapting. We let it. You allowed it to study you. Yes. And that did not concern you? It did, he said, but it concerned me less than engaging something we did not understand. Another pause. Drev's gaze did not leave him. So you waited? Yes. For what? For it to become confident. A quiet stillness settled again. That is risky, one of the generals said. Yes. And if your assessment had been incorrect? The human's expression remained unchanged. Then we would have learned something else. A few members of the court exchanged looks at that. That is a very calm way of describing potential destruction, one advisor muttered. The human gave a slight shrug. It would have been accurate. A faint sound escaped someone in the back. Half a laugh, half disbelief. Drev did not laugh, but there was something in her eyes now that had not been there before. Not surprise, not even curiosity, recognition. And when it became confident, she asked, the human took a breath, not from hesitation, but from precision. It revealed its structure, he said. Not fully, just enough. What kind of structure? Drev asked. Modular, distributed, each piece capable of independent function, but connected. Like a swarm. Yes. Intelligent. Yes. Another pause. And your response? Drev asked. The human tilted his head slightly, as if recalling something almost inconvenient. We pretended not to notice. A moment passed, then another. You pretended, Drev said slowly, not to notice. An intelligent, adaptive swarm following you. Yes. One of the advisors leaned back, exhaling softly. I am no longer certain whether this is brilliance or a very controlled form of recklessness. The human glanced briefly in his direction. It can be both. That earned a small, genuine laugh from several corners of the chamber. Even Drev's expression shifted, just slightly. Not a smile, but something close enough to be noticed if one were paying very careful attention. Continue, she said. The human nodded. We changed direction, he said. Moved toward a region with unstable gravitational fields. Difficult terrain. Limited visibility. And you brought it with you. Yes. Why? He answered without delay. Because we understood that environment better than it did. A quiet hum of agreement moved through a few of the more experienced commanders. Drev's ears angled forward slightly. So you shifted the battlefield? Yes. And then? The human paused again. Not long. Just enough. We made a mistake. That word landed differently than anything he had said before. Drev did not interrupt. What mistake? She asked. We underestimated how quickly it could adapt. The chamber held still. And? Drev prompted. The human looked at her directly. It adapted faster than we expected, he said. And for a moment, he stopped. For a moment? Drev asked. We were not winning. Silence. Heavy this time. Not skeptical. Not amused. Just real. And then, after a heartbeat, the human added, almost as an afterthought. But that only lasted a moment. The chamber seemed to narrow around the space between them. Not physically. The walls did not move. The light did not dim. But attention gathered so tightly that everything else felt distant. The human's last sentence lingered in the air, simple and unadorned, as if it had not yet decided whether it belonged to victory or warning. Queen Drev studied him without blinking. For a moment, she repeated. Yes. You were not winning. Yes. A faint shift passed through the court. It was a subtle kind of discomfort, the kind that came not from fear, but from unfamiliar honesty. Most commanders did not speak of moments like that. They erased them or reshaped them into something more flattering. Drev's long ears angled slightly outward, then settled again. Explain the moment. The human nodded once. The gravitational field in that region was unstable, he said. Not chaotic, patterned but difficult to predict without prolonged observation. We assumed the swarm would struggle to maintain cohesion. And it did not, Drev said. It did, he replied, for approximately 11 seconds. A pause. 11 seconds, one of the advisors repeated quietly. Yes, that is not a long time, No, the human said, but it is enough time to make a wrong decision. A faint murmur followed that. Drev did not look away from him. What decision did you make? I attempted to exploit the instability too quickly. And? And the swarm adapted faster than we adjusted. Another silence. This one carried weight. The human continued without hesitation. It redistributed mass, altered its movement pattern. Instead of resisting the gravitational shifts, it aligned with them. A few of the engineers in the chamber leaned forward at that. That is efficient, one of them said. Yes, the human replied. It stopped fighting the environment and started using it. Drev's gaze sharpened slightly. And you did not anticipate this? No. A faint exhale came from somewhere behind the main circle of advisors. That is unfortunate, someone whispered. The human nodded. It was. A brief pause followed, then one of the generals crossed his arms. And this is the moment where you were not winning, he said. Yes. And what exactly does not winning look like in this situation? The human considered the question for a second. It looks like realizing that your plan has become part of the enemy's plan. The general's expression shifted, just slightly. That is not ideal. No, the human agreed. A small ripple of restrained amusement passed through the chamber, not at the situation itself, but at the understatement. Drev took one slow step closer. Describe your position at that moment. The human met her gaze without hesitation. We were surrounded, he said. Not physically at first, structurally. Clarify. The swarm did not close in immediately. It adjusted its formation to influence our movement. Every direction we considered led us where it wanted. A quiet stillness followed that. You were being guided, Drev said. Yes. Like prey. Yes. Another pause. And yet, Drev said softly, you are here. Yes. One of the advisors leaned slightly forward. I would be very interested in how that transition occurred. The human glanced briefly in his direction. So was I. A few quiet laughs escaped before anyone could stop them. Drev did not laugh, but something in her expression shifted again. Subtle, precise, like a calculation adjusting its parameters. What did you do? She asked. The human took a breath. I stopped trying to win. That landed harder than expected. The chamber did not react immediately. It took a second for the meaning to settle. You stopped, one of the generals said slowly, trying to win. Yes, that seems counterproductive. It was necessary. Explain. The human nodded slightly. The more we tried to outmaneuver it, the more it learned from us. Every decision we made gave it more information. So we reduced our decisions. You became predictable, Drev said. Yes. And that helped you? It made us less informative. A brief pause. That is a strange strategy, one of the advisors said. Yes. Did it work? The human tilted his head slightly. Not immediately. A faint chuckle moved through the chamber. That seems to be a pattern, the advisor muttered. The human continued. We stabilized our movement, reduced variation, limited communication signals. We became simple. Drev's eyes narrowed slightly. You reduced your own complexity. Yes. Why? Because it expected complexity. Another silence. This one felt different again. Not heavy, not skeptical, just attentive. And what did the swarm do? Drev asked. It hesitated. A faint shift moved through the room. Hesitated, she repeated. Yes. For how long? Less than a second. That is not long. No, the human said. But it was enough. Drev did not move. What happened in that second? She asked. The human's expression remained calm. We changed everything. A few of the advisors exchanged quick glances. That sounds dramatic, one of them said. It was efficient, the human replied. A small smile appeared on someone's face. Drev's gaze did not waver. How, she asked quietly, do you change everything in less than a second? The human paused, not because he did not know, but because the answer for once required a choice. Then he spoke. We stopped being predictable, he said. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt precise, like a calculation waiting for its final variable. Queen Drev did not move, though the focus of the entire chamber seemed to tighten around her and the human standing before her. Her long ears angled slightly forward, the smallest sign that her attention had sharpened even further. "You stopped being predictable," she repeated. "Yes." "In less than a second." "Yes." A faint shift moved through the court, not disbelief this time, but the quiet discomfort of people realizing they were about to hear something they would not easily forget. Drev's voice lowered, not in volume, but in weight. "Explain." The human gave a small nod. "We had already reduced our patterns," he said. "Stabilized movement, limited signals. The swarm adapted to that quickly. It began to predict our next steps with increasing accuracy." "That is what adaptive systems do," one of the engineers said quietly. "Yes," the human replied. "So we gave it something to predict." A brief pause. "And then we broke it." The engineer blinked. "That sounds intentionally misleading." "It was," the human said. A few quiet laughs escaped, quickly suppressed. Drev did not smile. "What exactly did you give it?" The human shifted his stance slightly, not out of discomfort, but as if aligning himself with the memory again. "A pattern," he said. "A very clear one. Repeated movement, repeated signal timing. Something simple enough that it would lock onto it." "And it did?" "Yes." "How long did that take?" "Less than 5 seconds." A low murmur passed through the chamber. "That is fast," someone whispered. "Yes," the human said. "It was efficient." Drev's gaze narrowed slightly. "And during those 5 seconds, you allowed it to learn you?" "Yes." "That is a dangerous decision." "Yes." A faint ripple of restrained amusement moved through the advisors again. "You seem very comfortable with dangerous decisions," one of them said. The human glanced briefly in his direction. "Only when the alternatives are worse." That earned a few more quiet reactions. Drev took another step closer. "And then," she said, "you broke the pattern." "Yes." "How?" The human paused for a fraction of a second. "We introduced randomness." A small silence followed. "That is not unusual," one of the generals said. "Many systems use—" "Not calculated randomness," the human interrupted, still calm. "Actual randomness." That stopped the general. "Explain," Drev said. The human nodded slightly. "We disconnected certain predictive systems, disabled automated corrections. For a brief moment, we relied on manual input." "Manual," the engineer repeated, clearly unsettled. "You removed computational assistance during an adaptive engagement?" "Yes." "Why would you do that?" "Because the swarm was learning from our systems faster than from us." A quiet stillness settled again. "So you became less efficient," Drev said. "Yes." "And that made you harder to predict." "Yes." A faint exhale came from somewhere behind the main circle. "That is uncomfortable logic," an advisor murmured. The human gave a small shrug. "It worked." A few restrained smiles appeared again. Drev did not smile, but something in her expression shifted, something sharper, more focused. "And in that moment of randomness," she said, "you acted." "Yes." "What did you do?" The human looked at her directly. "We changed direction." A pause. "That is all?" one of the advisors asked. "Yes." Another pause. "That seems insufficient." "Yes," the human said. "That is why it worked." A few quiet laughs slipped through again. Drev's ears tilted slightly, the motion almost imperceptible. "You are suggesting that simplicity was the disruption?" "Yes." "And the swarm did not anticipate this?" "No." "Why?" The human considered that for a moment. "Because it expected us to remain consistent," he said. "We had trained it to expect that." A quiet shift moved through the chamber again. "You taught the enemy how to think," Drev said. "Yes." "And then you changed your own thinking." "Yes." Another silence followed. This one felt different. Not heavy, not tense. Just understanding, slowly forming. "And the result?" Drev asked. The human paused just slightly. "We broke its formation." "How?" "It tried to recalculate too quickly. Its structure depended on coordination. When its predictions failed, its timing failed. And it created gaps. A few of the generals leaned forward at that. Openings, one of them said. Yes. And you exploited them? Yes. How long did that window last? The human's expression remained steady. Not long, he said. Less than a second. A faint ripple of disbelief moved through the chamber. Everything important seems to happen in less than a second for you, an advisor muttered. The human gave a small, almost apologetic nod. That is usually when people are not paying attention. That earned a quiet laugh, this time even from one of the more rigid commanders. Drev did not laugh, but for the first time, there was something unmistakable in her gaze. Not curiosity, not skepticism. Something closer to recognition sharpened into interest. And in that moment, she said softly, "You won." The human shook his head slightly. "No." A pause. "No," Drev repeated. "No," he said. "That is when we survived." Another silence followed. He held her gaze. The victory came after. The distinction settled into the chamber like something heavy enough to alter its structure. Survival, victory, two different outcomes, two different moments. Queen Drev did not move for several seconds. Her gaze remained fixed on the human, but the rest of the chamber seemed to fade slightly in importance, as if everything else had been temporarily deprioritized. "You survived," she said. "Yes." "And only after that, you won." "Yes." A faint shift passed through the advisors. It was subtle, but it carried a different weight now. They were no longer listening for spectacle. They were listening for method. Drev's long ears angled slightly, precise and controlled. "Explain the difference." The human nodded once. "When we broke its formation," he said, "we created space. Not safety, just space." A quiet pause followed. "Space is useful," one of the generals murmured. "It is temporary," the human replied. A few heads tilted at that. Drev stepped slightly to the side, circling him slowly, not as a predator, not quite, but as someone studying a problem from multiple angles. "And what did you do with this space?" and she asked. "We stopped moving." That caused a reaction. "You stopped?" an advisor repeated. "Yes." "You had an advantage and you stopped?" "Yes." "That seems—" The advisor hesitated, searching for a word that would not sound insulting. "Inefficient." The human gave a small nod. "It looked that way." A few quiet chuckles slipped through the chamber. Drev did not laugh, but her attention sharpened further. "Why did you stop?" The human shifted his stance slightly, grounding himself in the explanation. "Because the swarm expected us to keep moving," he said. "It had adapted to our momentum, our changes in direction, our attempts to escape. And by stopping," Drev said, "you removed that variable." "Yes." A faint silence followed. "That is uncomfortable logic again," one of the advisors muttered. The human allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. "It was uncomfortable at the time." A few more quiet laughs followed. Drev continued her slow movement, stopping just behind him now, her presence still clearly felt. "And what did the swarm do?" she asked. "It hesitated again." A pause. "It hesitates often," she observed. "Yes," the human said, "but only for very short periods." "And you rely on those moments?" "Yes." Drev stepped back into his line of sight. "That is a dangerous habit." "Yes." Another ripple of restrained amusement moved through the chamber. "You acknowledge risk very easily," one of the generals said. "It is easier than avoiding it," the human replied. That earned a few more reactions, some amused, some thoughtful. Drev's gaze remained steady. "Continue." The human nodded. "When we stopped, the swarm attempted to re-establish its predictive model," he said, "but there was no movement to predict. So it adapted again." "Yes." "How?" "It shifted from prediction to observation." A faint pause. "That seems logical," one of the engineers said. "Yes," the human replied, "but slower." A few of the more experienced commanders nodded slightly at that. Drev's ears angled forward again. "And you use that delay?" "Yes." "How?" The human took a breath, not from hesitation, but from precision. "We deployed a false signal. A small silence followed. False how? Drev asked. It mimicked our previous pattern, he said. Movement, communication, energy output, all of it. But it was not us. A few heads turned toward each other. A decoy, one of the generals said. Yes. And the swarm followed it. Yes. Drev tilted her head slightly. That seems predictable. It was, the human said, because we designed it to be. A faint ripple of quiet amusement moved through the chamber again. You make it sound very simple, an advisor said. It was not, the human replied. A few more quiet laughs followed. Drev did not laugh, but something in her expression softened, not in weakness, but in recognition of complexity handled without unnecessary noise. And while it followed the decoy, she said, you acted. Yes. What did you do? The human met her gaze directly. We targeted its coordination nodes. A deeper silence settled now. Specific nodes? One of the engineers asked. Yes. How did you identify them? The human paused for a fraction of a second. They were the ones that did not hesitate. That caused a reaction, a stronger one this time. That is, the engineer stopped, then tried again. That is not standard analysis. No, the human said, but it was consistent. Drev's eyes narrowed slightly. You identified the most stable elements in an unstable system. Yes. And you removed them. Yes. Another silence. Heavy, but not uncomfortable. Just real. And the result? Drev asked. The human answered without delay. The swarm lost synchronization. A few of the generals nodded immediately. That would collapse its efficiency, one of them said. Yes. And then? The human's expression remained calm. Then it became predictable again. A faint pause. And that, Drev said softly, is when you won. The human tilted his head slightly. Yes. A quiet stillness followed. Drev studied him for a long moment. You removed its ability to adapt, she said. No, the human replied. A brief pause. No, she repeated. No, he said. We removed its ability to adapt faster than us. Another silence. This one lingered, because it carried something different, not just understanding, respect. Somewhere in the chamber, one of the advisors exhaled slowly. I am beginning to understand why the records did not feel exaggerated. Another replied just as quietly, I am beginning to think they were understated. The human stood where he had always stood, no change in posture, no shift in tone, as if none of this had ever been remarkable to him. Drev looked at him for a moment longer. Then she spoke. And the other 15 battles? The human paused, not because he did not have an answer, but because, for the first time, he allowed a small trace of humor to surface. They were similar. A quiet wave of laughter moved through the chamber. Even Drev's expression shifted, just slightly. Of course they were, she said. The chamber did not return to normal. It simply adjusted to a new understanding. For a long moment, no one spoke. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been placed carefully in the space between them. Queen Drev turned away first, not in dismissal, in thought. She moved slowly back toward her throne, each step measured, the polished floor reflecting her figure with quiet precision. The court remained still, watching, not her authority, but her consideration. That alone was unusual. She did not sit immediately. Instead, she stopped halfway, her back still partially turned to the human. 16 victory, she said, almost to herself. Yes, the human replied. And no losses? Yes. A brief pause followed. Drev turned slightly, enough for her gaze to reach him again. You do not seem particularly proud of this. The human considered the question. I am aware of it, he said. A faint ripple of restrained amusement moved through the chamber. That is a very modest description, one of the advisors whispered. Drev's ears angled slightly, acknowledging the comment without looking at him. Most would have constructed a legend from such a record. The human nodded once. That would make the next battle more difficult. A few quiet laughs escaped. Drev studied him carefully. Explain. If I believe the legend, he said, I stopped noticing the small things. A pause. The hesitation, Drev said. Yes. Another silence followed. This one felt settled, not heavy, not tense, complete. Drev finally ascended the remaining steps and took her seat. The motion carried its usual authority, but something had changed. Subtle, but unmistakable. The distance between ruler and subject felt recalibrated. She leaned slightly forward, her long ears angled toward him with quiet intent. You have answered my questions, she said. Yes. You have demonstrated your methods. Yes. And you have confirmed that the records are not exaggerated. Yes. A faint pause. In fact, one of the advisors murmured, they may be insufficient. A few quiet nods followed. Drev did not acknowledge them directly. Instead, she focused on the human. You will be reassigned, she said. The chamber shifted slightly at that. Not surprise, anticipation. The human did not react immediately. Yes, he said. You will join my strategic command. A deeper silence followed. Even the advisors who had been quietly amused earlier now straightened slightly. That is not a small decision, one of the generals said under his breath. Drev's gaze did not move. I am aware. The human stood still, processing the statement not with visible excitement, but with the same calm evaluation he had applied to everything else. Yes, he said again. A faint smile touched one of the advisors' faces. He accepts promotion the same way he accepts survival. Efficiently, another replied. Drev's attention remained fixed. There is one more matter, she said. The chamber stilled again. You have described your victories in detail, she continued. Your decisions, your adjustments, your mistakes. Yes, but you have not described your losses. A pause. The human's expression did not change, but something in the room shifted slightly, as if a new question had entered the structure of the conversation. I have not lost a battle, he said. That is what the records state. Yes. Drev leaned forward slightly. That is not what I asked. A longer pause followed this time. Not uncomfortable, just precise. The human took a breath. I have lost people, he said. The chamber grew very still. Drev did not interrupt. I have made decisions that were correct, he continued, and still cost something. A quiet weight settled into the space. That is different from losing a battle, one of the advisors said softly. Yes, the human replied, but it is not different to the people who are gone. Another silence followed, deeper, more real. Drev studied him carefully. And what have you learned from that? She asked. The human met her gaze. That victory is not the same as absence of loss, he said, and that clarity matters more when the cost is not theoretical. A faint shift passed through the chamber. Not discomfort, recognition. Drev leaned back slowly, her expression thoughtful. That is why you do not build legends, she said. Yes. Because they remove the cost. Yes. Another pause. Then unexpectedly, one of the advisors spoke up. Well, he said lightly, I will still tell people I was present for this conversation. That seems like a safe exaggeration. A few quiet laughs broke the tension. Even Drev allowed the faintest hint of amusement to pass through her expression. Be careful, she said. You may find yourself assigned to something more dangerous. The advisor immediately straightened. I will remain silent. More quiet laughter followed. The chamber eased, not back to what it had been, but into something new. Drev's gaze returned to the human one, final time. You will report to my command at the next cycle, she said. Yes. And you will continue to notice the small things. Yes. A brief pause. Then with a precision that carried both authority and something quieter beneath it, she added, I would like to hear about the 17th battle when it happens. The human considered that for a moment. Then he gave a small nod. Yes, he said. A faint smile appeared, this time unmistakable. Try not to be late, Drev said. A quiet ripple of laughter moved through the chamber. The human allowed himself the slightest pause. I will attempt to arrive at the correct time, he said. Drev's ears shifted once more, the motion subtle and precise. That, she said, will be sufficient. And for the first time since he had entered, the chamber did not feel like a place designed to remind others of their limits. It felt like a place where something had just begun,